Okay, so as Una said, I'm going to provide an update on Lake Trout and Ontario waters. The talk is essentially an update from a presentation that Lloyd Moore had given back in 2013 to this audience. The information I'm going to present this time, however, is almost entirely from Ontario data sets. Adam Cottrell helped me compiling information, updating figures, but the information is sort of a product of all the hard work and resources of the Upper Great Lakes Management Unit team. So this is just sort of an outline. Basically, I'm going to go through a bit of it'll be an update or a refresh for some of you that know or are familiar with the Ontario Rehabilitation Plan for Lake Trout. For those of you that aren't familiar, it'll be an introduction, but I'm going to talk about how we're measuring the status of lake trout. I'm going to give a little bit of and then following that I'll give a sort of a background, basin by basin, just sort of a background on trying to put things into context, and then I'll go through the dynamics that we've provided updates on. First at a broad geographic scale. And that's sort of in contradiction to how our lake trout rehab plan is designed. So that's why I want to try and give that context so that you've got that background in terms of how I'm going to tie in some of those things at the end, which is relating to spawning population assessments and kind of go from there. So the plan, although it's in draft form now, we continue to proceed with the recommendations that are in that and make progress. But fundamentally, we've got a series of rehabilitation zones. They're located in relation to concentrations of spawning habitat, so that the spawning habitat would then basically establish the core for the rehab zone, and that then provided a focus initially for the stocking efforts. So an area we're basically trying to plant fish into places that they'll consider home. They'll come back, build and establish a spawning population, sort of at a small scale, and then they'll fan out into the lake. That's where the fisheries occur and those kinds of things. And then that'll also gives us a way to sort of assess our progress by establishing a core place to go back and look. This follows sort of on the same kind of themes that Stephen had laid out for Cisco and follows themes for other rehab efforts, is that you start at a small scale and then pick some focal points and locations and then work out from there. So then I'm going to talk about, the plan had some areas that were priority ranked. I'll talk a little bit about the areas that we're focusing on and then some of the ongoing assessments that we've got as well. We also have a revised approach for stocking. I won't dwell on that here today, sort of part of a different presentation maybe, but just in terms of increasing stocking density and focusing on some areas, they're part of the plan as well. So this is a map of the lake trout rehab zones. There's 17 throughout the lake. They're all monitored and have objectives for rehabilitation. Most of the objectives are pretty similar in terms of establishing spawning stocks and density and that kind of thing. But there's only 5 that are currently being stocked, and that's as of 2016. So these are Rehab Zone 2, which is in the North Channel. It's considered the eastern edge of the North Channel. 5 is in Iroquois Bay. It was a remnant population that had survived lamprey invasion. 7 is around the Limestone Islands, or the central Georgian Bay. Number 8 is the Watcher Islands, and 9 being Mary Ward Shoal. So this is just sort of, let people know where we're at on the rehab goals and objectives, and these are the places that we're focusing on now. So measuring progress evaluation relates to sort of 5 fundamental places that we sort of focus and do assessments and have metrics around. One being abundance, age class structure, total annual mortality, natural reproduction, and spawning stock size. The first 4 I'm going to sort of go over and describe on broader geographic scales. We could look at them in fine scales, but most of our assessment sort of for this audience, I thought it was best to look at those larger areas and provide sort of big picture how we're doing progress towards rehabilitation, sort of following along what G was talking about in the main basin. I'm going to use that and frame the other 2 basins as well. So of course this is Lake Huron. It's made up of 3 basins, each having distinct characteristics. So starting with the main basin, there's a very long history of stocking and rehabilitation efforts here. Virtually all indicators are currently positive. It's sort of the gold standard in terms of available information. There's a lot of different agencies working here, a lot of different work being done. So we've got things ranging from just general survey results, there's modeling, a lot of commercial catch sampling, and then we can talk about characteristics of spawning stock in a few places where we've got that information. In Georgian Bay, slight contrast. It does have a long history of stocking, but the characteristics are a little bit distinct from the main basin. And I'll go through some of those. There's an abundance of habitat, much of this being in the shield country, relatively low fishing pressure, and has traditionally had very low lamprey mortality, although that's changed a little bit in recent years. There's a long history of rehabilitation success. In particular, Perry Sound is we consider rehabilitated basically and self-sustaining, and sort of our flagship. And for a time, there was pretty reasonable success in Owen Sound, although I think we've seen regression in that regard more recently. We have less sort of widespread information and data. We're the only agency, of course, on Georgian Bay. Much of the available information is also localized to small areas. And then, of course, large parts of Georgian Bay are quite remote for us to stock or even to assess. So looking then at the North Channel, this is sort of going in decreasing amounts of information. So the North Channel, less data than the main basin in Georgian Bay. It also has characteristics that sort of are distinct from the main basin. There's also a long history of stocking here. Probably our best information source here is a commercial fishery, which has the best time series. And then we do have some less frequent and more focused independent surveys. And in this area, lamprey marking has always been quite high. So then just sort of basically I wanted to provide some sort of context for the information. So this is just the stocking history. The main basin includes information from both Canadian and U.S. waters. The plots show the number of yearling equivalent lake trout stocked annually in the 3 basins of Lake Huron. And we've sort of broken out some of the, worthy of separating or distinguishing strains of lake trout. So there's, you could see early on in the history of, especially in the North Channel and Georgian Bay, there was quite a bit of splake and backcross stocking. And more recently, there and to a greater extent in the main basin, Seneca strain have been stocked sort of from about 1995 on, nearly 50% of the stocking in the main basin being Seneca strain and increasing towards the end. And then we've seen less of those strains in Georgian Bay and the North Channel, a little bit of Seneca and Georgian Bay. And then also we've seen sort of genetic signature for some Manitoulin strains, so we'd included those there as well. But mostly just wanted to sort of, these are all on the same scale, so you can see the stocking efforts certainly emphasize the main basin and ramped up in Georgian Bay and the North Channel. Smaller piece of water, so stocking densities may be comparable, but lower numbers overall. So moving into the metrics, this is sort of follows along on what G was talking about just more recently. This is abundance as might be indexed in the commercial fishery. So these are commercial fishery catch rates. The line is the kilograms of lake trout per kilometer of net. So the main basin, this is large mesh gillnet CPUE, where either lake trout or lake whitefish were targeted. We don't have a lot of targeted lake trout fishing, but there's an incidental catch in a lot of the whitefish fisheries. So we couple those two when we're talking about CPUE measures. So you can see that the trends vary between the 3 basins. We actually had, they're all on the same scale again, just to show the relative difference between the basins. So both the North Channel and the main basin, we've seen general and increasing trend in terms of lake trout catch and presumably abundance. It actually, in Georgian Bay in contrast, it peaked, and was highly erratic, and those largely reflected stocking events in certain areas where commercial fisheries were focused. but more recently, pretty significant decline in lake trout catch rate in the commercial fishery there. And currently, catch rates are comparable actually between the North Channel and Georgian Bay. So this is our independent fishery assessment. So this is the catch per unit effort of lake trout in our main basin and southern Georgian Bay index programs. There's a different y-axis scale, and that's just so you can even see the netting results from the main basin with respect to Georgian Bay. They're I don't know how well you can make it out, but they're about 5 times, so it's 20 on Georgian Bay and as high as 5 on the main basin. So these are the geometric mean catch per unit effort and offshore index programs. It includes all splake, backcross, and lake trout because early on in Georgian Bay, much of the catch would have been backcross fish. And there's no fishery independent survey with a long time series in North Channel. We've been adding, since 2006, we've been adding more lake trout targeted sets up in that area. I didn't include it here because it's fairly variable still at this point, and we have to do things in terms of weeding out the shallower water stuff to make it more comparable. But you can see that these sort of, generally speaking, agree with what we see in the commercial catch, and that there's one key difference here is that this is a shorter time series. It doesn't go back to the 80s like the commercial CPUE plots that I showed earlier were. But generally speaking, an increasing trend in the main basin, especially in the last little while, and we see that decline in Georgian Bay in our index. So age composition is another key indicator for progress towards rehabilitation. So lake trout are long-lived and should have a broad age distribution and a high proportion of older individuals. So these plots show the age composition of lake trout sampled from commercial gill nets. So just to provide, this is our one data set that's got enough fish in it and consistently collected over time to provide, sort of relative trend information. It's not the best cross section of the population. It's primarily, it's fish that are catchable in the commercial fishery. They tend to be older, but it's the best sort of long-term comparative data set we have. So this is the size of the bubbles here are basically the proportions of fish in different age classes. The red line, that sort of jagged red line, is the mean age within each year, and then for reference there's a blue horizontal line, and that blue horizontal line represents the mean age at maturity for lake trout that we've seen. We haven't seen, although that might change over time, we haven't seen large changes in our analysis. So one of the indicators of rehabilitation that we've identified is that we would have mean age about 1 or 2 years older than the age of first maturity, so that you've sort of guaranteed successful spawning. You can see in the main basin we are seeing that metric being met, however not so much in the North Channel, and losing ground in Georgian Bay. So another measure would be the modal age, which is the largest bubble on the plots, and we're starting to see that creep up over the benchmark in the main basin, but again not in the other 2 basins. So this would be, these are bar plots, and I was afraid this might happen, but there's 2 different shades they're representing either wild or stocked fish. So this would be corresponding to this. These are sort of fresh, hot off the presses. These are the 2015 commercial fishery ages. They would correspond to the rightmost bubbles in the previous plots. So looking at, so they're the commercial catch in the Terra waters, and I've weighted these in this case by the mean commercial catch rate for those 3 basins to show not only the age distributions and the proportions of wild fish, but also how they might reflect, progress towards sustainability or having enough fish in the population of sort of those older fish. So we can see here the modal ages increase by about a year when you go from the main basin, or so decrease by about a year when you go from the main basin towards the North Channel and then to Georgian Bay, so younger fish. And you can also see the proportion of wild, presumed wild, these are unclipped fish, increasing or decreasing as well. So 76% wild fish through all fish sampled in the main basin, 63 in the North Channel, and 20% in Georgian Bay. So sort of looking at that, so and one of the things that we also see here is that many of the younger fish are now wild, whereas in the main basin, whereas in Georgian Bay, the young fish are actually still dominated by stocked fish, and it's the older fish that are wild. So just sort of looking at trends in those proportions then of wild fish. So proportion unclipped, this is observed in Ontario commercial fish sampling, catch sampling between 1990 and 2015. So the two horizontal lines, the lower one indicating 5%, so this is sort of the background. These might be fish that were missed clips or fin regenerations. So you see they're sort of, in the main basin, there was hanging in and around that number. Those are just probably fish that should have been clipped but weren't. And then the two horizontal lines that are further up that's a benchmark. We have 50% wild fish in the population. So if you get beyond that, you're basically getting more than half the fish being wild, and it should start to take off on its own. So we did see, for instance, all three basins, one similarity is that all three basins showed there's a remarkable synchrony in terms of getting recruitment of wild fish to the commercial fishing gear. There's a rapid increase from sort of 2007 to 2010, presumably following collapse of alewife and a response there. And while the main basin and the North Channel both continued to increase in terms of their wild fish percentages, it sort of stalled in Georgian Bay at around a third. But we continue to see dominance of wild fish in both the other basins. So looking at lamprey wounding, I mean, we've already seen some of this from Paul earlier today. Lamprey predation has long been recognized as one of the major impediments to lake trout rehabilitation. So these plots are showing mean annual wounding rates in each of the three basins. This is from all of our lake trout captured in all of our programs. And it's the entire season. So typically what many of those indices are sort of spring indices are the ones that are used. This is just to show sort of annual wounding rates that we see, because we don't, obviously we really reduce our sample sizes if we were only looking at our April data. We wanted to be able to look at fish captured throughout the year. So the dotted line there is the 5 marks per 100 fish. That's a dashed line at the bottom. And we can see that wounding rates have remained consistently low in the main basin. They've been quite variable and generally higher in the North Channel, although the same kind of pattern that Paul was reporting earlier is that we've seen a recent decline in wounding rates there. And Georgian Bay, in contrast, used to have the lowest wounding rates anywhere, and now we're starting to see wounding exceed the threshold. So this is one of the places we're a little bit concerned. We don't think that's probably the whole story, certainly in Georgian Bay, but some concern about increased wounding rates there. So one of the places that this goes, of course, is into total mortality rates. So these are catch curve mortality rates determined using two methods from the commercial fish biological information. So there's just basically we just want to corroborate a simple catch curve by looking at the Chapman as well. The two dotted lines then represent our targets of maximum of 40% total annual mortality for lake trout. We don't figure we're going to make progress if we're seeing mortality rates above that line. The lower the better, obviously. What we have seen recently is a mortality rate declining since about 2005, and generally been below the maximum level since that point in terms of considered sustainable. One issue, though, is that the total mortality in these is actually reflective of these are the commercially caught fish. So this is fish over about 4 years of age. What we're not getting from this is that very early mortality, and we're considering that that's probably one of the issues that we're having, certainly in in Georgian Bay. So to that end, this is pretty similar to the stuff Gia just put up. There are some subtle differences that you can't really make direct comparisons. There's sort of different assessment methods at play here. But the plot on the left, that's the geometric mean catch per unit effort of age 7 Lake Trout Cotton Michigan DNR survey. So this is the stuff that Gia put up earlier. We just put a smooth line to sort of highlight what's been going on there. I don't think this has been updated as recently as this stuff G had. But it's the number of yearling equivalent stocked for that year class. And basically just been a real decline. And this may, G says this is maybe confounded by differences in catchability, but there's probably something in here in terms of lower survival of fish to age 7 compared to how many are stocked. So the 4 panel on the right shows the mean CPUE, and there's age 3, 4, 5, and 6. So looking at survival to each of those ages, we used to have very good survival to ages 3 and 4, and it wasn't as good to 5 and 6. That was when they were entering commercial fisheries and more subject to mortality there as older fish. But we've seen a decline for all those ages in more recent years. The thinking in the main basin was that it may be related, and this is information sort of gleaned from Lake Superior experience, was that there may be a cannibalism effect and lower survival as a result of that. That we do have some evidence that could be the case in the main basin, where we are seeing increased adult densities, but we have not seen that. As I showed in the previous plots, we have declining indices of abundance in Georgian Bay, so it wouldn't make sense that the decreased survival is as a result of cannibalism if we're having fewer adults out there to begin with. So we're not sure where this is coming from, but it doesn't seem we're getting the survival we used to from our stocked fish. So switching then to some spawning population surveys. This is where I'll talk about the very specific, just very briefly go over the very specific stuff we got from our some of our recent work. So as part of the long-term assessment plan, we've done 5 of the Lake to Rehab zones over the last 4 years. So the circles here that you probably can't make out are surveys we've done in 2012 and 13. We surveyed South Bay and the eastern end of Manitoulin Island. Then we, 14 and 15, we moved to Parry Sound. As I said, that's sort of our frame of reference. It provides us sort of a touchstone, and we can see how our metrics are holding up in terms of that population. Helps us establish our benchmarks for what we'd expect to see in a population that's basically sustainable and potentially near carrying capacity. One of our tactics here is basically to do back-to-back surveys, and this is just we're learning how repeatable our assessment methods are, so we're going back-to-back so that we can compare the results over those 2 years. It does 2 things. It enhances our biological sample size. Some of these surveys we don't see more than maybe 100 fish in a survey. And it also ensures that sort of repeatability and gives us more faith in the information we're getting. So looking specifically then at what we found in the North Channel, so there is evidence here of a small and potentially localized spawning stock. Abundance is still well below our mid-range targets in this area. We had a very small proportion of unclipped fish in the survey, around 25%, which, as you may recall, is in contrast to what we see at a larger geographic scale in the North Channel. We have, close to 3/4 of those fish being unclipped or wild stock when we look at the whole of the North Channel. And in this case, you can see, I won't attempt to probably point at it, but there's that cluster of points on the bottom. So there's small circles showing where there's no catch, and the larger the circle, the higher the catch rates. And the lower edge there is basically all the cluster of points is very close to the stocking location for our shore stocking of fish in the North Channel. This is one of those places we have a lot of difficulty getting to with a boat to do offshore stocking. They've been put in since the beginning of the rehab program there as a shore stocking site, and they do seem to like to stay close to home. And the fact that we're seeing higher proportions of stocked fish there than we're seeing in the larger scale surveys would support that the planted fish are trying to spawn close to where they were released. Looking at South Bay, which was also done in 2012 and 13, again, evidence of a small localized spawning stock here. The abundance is not yet at the mid-range targets, but we are seeing relatively high proportion of unclipped fish. It was around 85%. This is one of the locations that we had been stocking up till last year, 2015. We've ceased stocking in this location, and we're going to watch how it does. Hopefully we see obviously we'll see a decline in the proportion of stocked fish there, and we're hoping that catch rates continue to increase or at least stabilize. Looking at Parry Sound, this is a healthy and robust spawning population. Abundance is stable at our long-term targets. We have fall walleye index netting and fall lake trout index netting and trap net index net sites that we've got there. Those both, they were used to establish the benchmarks. We could continue to see catch rates or abundance index there that's similar to what we'd established, and we see lots of signs of healthy reproduction in that location. A few remnant fish from the long time ago stocking events, but nearly 100% of those fish are unclipped. This last year, 2015, we went to Iroquois Bay, which is up at the north end of the Georgia Bay, or the east end of the North Channel. We're seeing very limited evidence of natural reproduction in this site. Abundance is well below our mid-range targets, and a pretty low percentage of unclipped fish. And there's an interesting phenomenon here where we're seeing very slow growth and very few large older fish. So I threw up a plot here of the length at age and this is based on clip-coated fish, and otolith ages to validate those. But you can see there's quite a few fish that are approaching 5, 6, 7 years of age, but they're still quite small. The photo at the bottom there was these fish had 3 different clip codes, so identifying them as 3 different age fish, and they're all in and around the sort of 35 centimeter mark. So it's almost like a stunting in that population. This could be related to fairly high stocking density. It's a really small piece of water and fairly high stocking rate there. So we may be seeing stunting, intraspecific competition that we're creating. We're going to be reducing the stocking density there, potentially even going to alternate year stocking to see if we can get more sort of spawning sized fish out of that effort. So Fraser Bay is immediately adjacent. It's just outside of Iroquois Bay, but it's separated by some shallow water. It's a different rehabilitation zone. Here we're seeing limited evidence of limited, but there is evidence of natural reproduction. Abundance is well below the mid-range targets, but we are seeing a higher percentage of unclipped fish here. So although density remains fairly low, there seems to be reasonable natural reproduction. It's actually doing better than our stocking efforts in this area. This is another place that because we're seeing wild recruits, we're going to stop stocking and watch it closely to see if it'll sort of get going on its own. So then basically just to recap here, rehab success is it's progressing fairly well in the main basin. Abundance continues to climb. There's a very high proportion of wild fish, and we're seeing success with strong year classes. We don't plan to do stocking in the main basin any longer at this point. We didn't stock in 2015, and we won't again this year, anywhere in the main basin. Rehabilitation's questionable in the North Channel. There's variable, what we're actually seeing probably is mostly an effect of fish coming from Drummond Island. Our assumption is since we're not seeing wild fish show up on spawning areas where we're trying to establish them in the North Channel, that when we see those wild fish come in, we're seeing them as 5 and 6 year olds. They're sort of expected to be coming from sort of outside. They're probably using that as foraging habitat and rather than living there their entire lives. We've seen poor survival of stocked lake trout, and although there's a high proportion of wild, as I said, that seems to be seasonal. And our spawning surveys are mixed, but generally low. Rehabilitation is poor still in Georgian Bay. High stocking rates, very poor survival, and it's declined certainly in recent years. We're seeing a lower moderate proportion of wild fish, and prairie sound, of course, remains in good health. So how this is modified to those stocking efforts we've got, we're moving to a bit more strategic stocking emphasis, planting fish in adjacent to but in deeper water, potentially improving survival, get them a little bit further from, we've got some avian predators, and there may be forage limitations in some places, so we're trying to spread them out a little bit thinner. And we're going to be stocking at about twice the density we had been before in terms of total numbers of fish. So that's all I have on that, and at this point I can take questions.